Right now, let's go to my next guest, Colonel Richard Kemp, the former commander of British forces in Afghanistan, and has also just returned from Gaza. We'll talk about that as well. But Richard, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much indeed. What do you make of, well, I suppose, where we are? I mean, you know, at 10:34 today, a ceasefire supposedly in place between Iran and Israel, announced by Donald Trump as a complete and total ceasefire last night. We've seen some missiles hitting Israel. Iran have denied they were from them. I'm not sure where else they've come from. But what do you make of what appears to be a ceasefire brokered by Donald Trump in the wake of those attacks on Iranian nuclear sites?
Yeah, I think the ceasefire, I'm not optimistic this ceasefire is going to hold indefinitely. I think Iran is more than capable of breaking the ceasefire. But having said that, Iran is on the ropes now, really. So in some ways, it's in Iran's interest for this war to end. So maybe they won't break the ceasefire. And I don't think Israel will break the ceasefire unless they identify potential aggressive activities from Iran. But at the end of this war, there's no doubt it's a very clear victory for Israel, and backed up by the United States. They've done huge damage to Iran. Iran has no strategic cards left to play.
Well, indeed, and it was interesting, so many in the commentariat, shall we say, in the political world, I would say even in our Prime Minister and our Foreign Secretary, feeling very obviously anxious about this attack on the nuclear sites, Fordo and other sites by America, and a lot of talk about how this was going to destabilise the Middle East, and goodness knows what could happen as a result. But surely the biggest instability is Iran funding terrorism and Hezbollah, the Houthi rebels, Hamas, and trying to build a nuclear weapon with which they absolutely were very clear they plan to use on Israel. I mean, did people not think that might be something to be concerned about?
They don't. I mean, Iran has been the single most destabilizing force in the Middle East for many, many years now. And that destabilization, its ability to carry out aggression against countries around the region using its proxies, is now ended, or at least for the time being. Most of its proxies have been knocked out by Israel. And Iran is really, I think, if anything, at risk of the regime falling. I think there's a strong risk of that happening at some point in the near future. But of course, our leaders in Western Europe, particularly including the UK, they can't understand the necessity to deal with a country like Iran in any other way than diplomatic means.
Why is it they can't understand that? Because one of the things I always like to do with these sort of stories is listen to the people who've got experience. I'm an armchair general. You're a real general. Military man. People who've actually been on the ground. And I'm always amazed by how many people, certainly in the political world, who think that everything can be negotiated and that's how wars end, and you can make an agreement with everybody. But just don't think that history tells us that.
No, it's far from that. And of course, war is terrible. And those people, I've been involved in a number of wars, and others like me understand that war is an awful thing to both be involved in and to witness. But there are some things that make war necessary. Some things are worse than war. And one of those things is a country like Iran, with a proven violent track record since its inception in 1979, the Islamic Revolution, getting their hands on nuclear weapons. That's worse than war. And unfortunately, I think many of our leaders look at countries like Iran and they see themselves in the mirror. They think Iranians, or the Iranian regime, thinks as we think. They don't. They think very differently. They will never negotiate anything that they consider disadvantageous to themselves. And if they do, they will never adhere to any agreement they make.
Yeah, small point worth making. Yes, whether we can trust what they have to say. Lots of people talked, and Tom Slater just mentioned this about, we need to learn the lessons from Iraq and Afghanistan, where you commanded British forces in Afghanistan, and we shouldn't be getting involved. And a lot of Americans, not our problem, don't get involved. What do you think the lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan should be?
Well, I think we've seen the lessons from Iraq and Afghanistan being learned certainly the last couple of weeks, because Israel and the US involvement in Iran bore no resemblance to Iraq and Afghanistan, where huge numbers of American and a certain number of British forces and other nations were bogged down on the ground for many years in a war that they were really unable to win. They didn't really have the willpower to put enough force in to win it. Maybe they couldn't have done, but they didn't. But this shows, I think, we haven't yet seen the kind of full outcome of this war, but I suspect it will show that what we need to achieve in Iraq and Afghanistan in this case can be implemented without putting boots on the ground. There have been no boots on the ground in Iran, except for a small number of Israeli special forces. But I think one point to note, I think, is that the experience in Iraq and Afghanistan terrified and traumatized generations of politicians.
Yeah.
And that's why they're unwilling to dip their toe in the water at all, for fear of being drawn into...
And that's what we saw with Syria, when people didn't get involved. And Ed Miliband now in the cabinet, leading that vote in Parliament against us getting involved in Syria to help the people being massacred. Again, everyone cares about certain massacres, but not others. But people in Syria being massacred by President Assad. And again, we saw the growth of ISIS. And it is sort of... you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. But I do think the lessons are rather more complicated than most politicians think. Talking about boots on the ground, we know, of course, IDF have got boots on the ground in Gaza. You have just returned from a trip to Israel and to Gaza, where I believe you were travelled into Gaza with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. This is the aid body taking food aid to people in Gaza. We've had extraordinary reports. I mean, focus taken away from Gaza in the last 12 days, obviously, after Israel took action against Iran. But all the claims we see, I mean, day in, day out, that from, either medics who couldn't possibly have been at the scene because of the hospital, or by Hamas-led health ministry, that the IDF have been firing routinely, massacring, I think is the only word you could use, Palestinian people in Gaza as they arrive to get aid. And that people are starving in Gaza, and there isn't enough aid, and there is chaos there. What did you see when you were on the ground?
Yeah, I'm actually still in Israel now, but I visited Gaza a few days ago, and I visited the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation base that's distributing aid, one of their 4 bases in Gaza. And I experienced exactly the way it works, and it works very well. It's not perfect, but it works. It gets aid into Gazan civilians without being controlled by Hamas. That's the entire idea of it. Hamas have seized control of almost all the aid that's gone into Gaza up to now. And that's the way they've maintained control in Gaza. This is a way of preventing that from happening. But I certainly didn't see any sign whatsoever of the IDF when I was at this base. They're on the periphery. They're maintaining sort of wider scale security for the bases, but the bases are being secured themselves by the GHF, basically by armed American civilians. I heard nothing from I spoke to many Gazans collecting aid, and I heard nothing about threats from the IDF against them or attacks by the IDF against them. I heard a great deal about threats made by Hamas against them if they use these facilities, because Hamas hate these facilities. They don't want them to use them. And they killed something like 8 local Gazans who were acting as staff at the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation base. That's where the threat is. And my guess is, if anyone's massacring Gazans anywhere near these aid bases, it's Hamas.
Well, indeed, what's really interesting is claim after claim after claim, often involving dozens of people being, having open fired on, men, women and children, is that there's something like 1.5 million mobile phones in Gaza, and phone footage of virtually anything that happens, and yet there never seems to be any phone footage of these massacres. No,
there aren't, and probably because they didn't occur. We don't know even if they did occur, but if they did occur, the likelihood is this was Hamas. The IDF have absolutely no interest in preventing aid distributed by the GHF. In fact,
they're organising it.
They're coordinating it. It's the most effective aid delivery system that has existed so far in Gaza. And interestingly, the 2 opponents of the GHF system, I mentioned Hamas. The other major opponent is the United Nations. They hate this. It takes kind of, it takes aid delivery away from them. They're still delivering a very small amount of aid compared to the vast amount of aid going in with the GHF. And the UN hate it, and they've been trying to shut it down.
Yeah, it is very interesting. Let me bring you closer to home here where we are. The British Prime Minister Keir Starmer is travelling to The Hague for the annual leaders meeting, leaders summit of NATO. We've had it announced that all NATO countries are going to be required, and Britain will sign up to this too, spending 5% of their GDP by 2035 on defence spending, although only 3.5% of that would be core defence needs. The rest of it, basically, they can decide themselves. So we could say, oh, we're going to pay Mauritius to rent back the Diego Garcia military base. We'll call that part of that, 1.5% extra, or a new third runway at Heathrow. Yeah, we'll put that in there. What do you make of that 5% commitment? Is it enough? Is it soon enough? And I mean, I don't know where we're going to get the extra £40 billion a year from, but your thoughts on that?
Well, our defences in the UK, and the same goes for other European countries, are so appallingly degraded that they do need at least 5% money going into them. But one thing I would say is whatever money you put in, whatever equipment you buy, you're dependent still to maintain a deterrent and make any use of those forces on political will. And that's simply not there among Western European leaders, including Keir Starmer, who over this latest operation against Iran was simply wringing his hands and complaining calling it illegal and objecting to it. And in fact, he's been so far distanced now from the US that he was unwittingly used as a part of Trump's deception plan. He came away from the G7 saying Trump's not going to attack Iran. Well, that message was clearly fed into him by Trump, which is it's the first time ever, I think, that Britain and America have been so distant.
I mean, he was duped. It's an embarrassment. It's a humiliation for our country, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, do you think that spending a lot more money on defence, some people are calling that warmongering? What would you say to that?
Well, I think, to me, the most important purpose of defence is deterrence. Above all, you want to try and deter war. You can only do that with military strength, and also political will, as I mentioned, but you need the military strength. And to do that, you've got to spend the money. It's not warmongering, it's the defence of our country. Obviously, if deterrence fails, then you have to have strong military forces to defend the country, and we simply don't have that. It's far from warmongering. It's an easy slogan to throw around by people who actually don't like our country and don't want our country to defend itself.
That's the worry, isn't it? Just finally, President Vladimir Zelensky of Ukraine has arrived at the NATO summit as well. He's done an interview this morning in which he's talked about how he thinks it's perfectly likely that Russia will test NATO's commitment to Article 5 and, attack on one is an attack on all within the next 5 years, and we need to prepare for that. Do you agree with Zelensky?
Yes, I do. I don't know about the 5-year time frame, but once Putin's done with Ukraine and has kind of licked his wounds and had sufficient time to rebuild his forces and prepare again, I'm very sure he will attempt to take a bite at a country like the Baltic states, possibly Poland, Romania, which are all part of NATO. Yeah. And my prediction is, unless something radically changes between now and then, NATO will not come to the defence of Poland, Baltic states or Romania. I cannot see Starmer or any of the Western European leaders sending their young men and women to fight and perhaps die in large numbers for a country they've never heard of in Eastern Europe.
And that is the worry. Colonel Richard Kemp, we covered a lot of ground there. So appreciate your time and your expertise. An experienced former commander of British forces in Afghanistan. He knows what he's talking about. Tom Slater, your response to whichever you want to come back on.
There's so much to talk about there, but it just is a reminder of what more serious times we live in, but what unserious politicians we're led by. That seems to be a bit of a
That's a good takeaway from that. Absolutely, absolutely.